I was recently wondering how the urban demographics of the US and the EU compare, and so, as one does, I copied several Wikipedia pages into this spreadsheet, which contains the 65 most populous metro areas in the US and the 65 most populous metro areas in the EU, with the EU being defined as of January 30th, 2020, so the UK is included. There's also the difference between their respective populations, as well as the ratio between their populations. Now, these numbers are not strictly speaking directly comparable. This is because there isn't really a consistent way of measuring the populations of metro areas in both the US and the EU, so what I've done instead is taken the definition for each region that gives the highest average population. So for the US, that was the US federal government's primary statistical areas, which is an unofficial way of grouping information in the US censuses. And for the EU, that was the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development's list of metropolitan areas. As a quick side tangent, there are two things I would like to point out here. The first is that there are two Birminghams. The second is that with the populations being measured this way, there just so happen to be exactly 65 metro areas in both the US and in the EU that have a population greater than 1 million people. Now, you may have noticed that the metro areas in the US tend to be significantly bigger. And I've actually bolded every single time that the EU metro area is larger than its equivalently placed US counterpart, and as you can see, it's not a lot of times. And if you are thinking that this is an incomprehensible wall of numbers, I agree, so here's a nice graph instead, with blue representing the EU and red representing the US. And here you can see that not only are the populations of metro areas in the US larger than their equivalently placed EU counterparts, they're a lot larger, and the bigger the metro area, the bigger the US one is generally by comparison. And another way of visualizing this data is this graph here, which shows the ratio between their populations, with the lowest gray line being 1 to 1. And here you can see that there's basically three groups. The first group is the largest 18 metro areas, where the US metro areas tend to be significantly bigger, anywhere from 50% to twice the size, with the US metro area that is largest compared to its EU counterpart being Houston versus Athens, with Houston being over twice the size. The other group is the middle third or so, where the US metro areas are anywhere from 20 to 40% larger. And then the last third or so is where they're basically the same size. And this is where Mannheim versus Albuquerque lies, which is the EU metro area that is largest compared to its US equivalent. Now, as someone who has been to a handful of metro areas from both parts of this list, this took me by surprise. I know that cities in the US tend to suburbanly sprawl on seemingly forever, but walking around cities in the EU, I had always gathered the impression that their vastly higher average density more than counteracted their comparatively smaller land area, but clearly that's not the case. Now, insofar as this illusion exists, it's not actually totally detached from reality. Because if you look at the populations of individual cities in the US and in the EU, defined as of January 30th, 2020, then you can see that with the exception of New York compared to London and Los Angeles compared to Berlin, every single one of the 17 largest cities in the EU is bigger than its equivalent of the 17 largest cities in the US. And since this is a smaller wall of numbers, but a wall of numbers nonetheless, here is a graph equivalent. And this makes it abundantly clear that the only two cities in the US, larger than their EU counterparts, are only a tiny bit larger. And for consistency's sake, here is the graph of the ratios, with this time the top line being 1 to 1. And here you can see that, well, New York and London Well, there's only a 5,000 person difference, which in two cities with populations of nearly 9 million people means that they're basically the same size. And Los Angeles is only a tiny bit larger than Berlin. Every other EU city out of the top 17 is larger than its US counterpart. So what's going on here? If cities in the EU tend to be much larger than their US counterparts, why are US metro areas so much larger? Well, it basically comes down to how the city borders are drawn. Take Berlin for an example. It's a relatively large, highly populous city, surrounded by a ring of smaller cities and towns that, combined with Berlin, make up the Berlin metro area. Somewhere like Chicago, for comparison, is still a large city, but it is surrounded by other almost equally large cities. Whereas metro areas in the EU tend to have one core city that dominates, surrounded by other cities, metro areas in the US tend to be clusters of all large cities. Not necessarily very large, but still large cities. Now, this is just a comparison between the EU and the US. So, what does this look like when we start adding in other countries? Well, going back to this graph, this is what it looks like when we add in Japan. And in case you're wondering, that one little orange dot that takes up the entire top third of the graph all by itself is Tokyo, a metro area with a population of 37 million people. Now, I did not know this when I had the idea to include Japan in this graph. I only chose Japan because it's a highly urban, high population country, but Japan actually has an official definition of a metro area. The country has 11 official main metro areas, although there are 13 dots on this graph because Wikipedia had 2 of its own to add. And you can see that they're actually strangely small for the most part. Only Tokyo and Osaka are larger than their US counterparts, and only the first 4 are larger than their EU counterparts. And since more data points, or at least more colorful lines, is better, I decided to add another highly populous and highly urban country. And, well, Brazil fit the bill. Now, here you can see that unlike the US and then Japan, Brazil doesn't have a city that single-handedly changes the scale of the entire graph, but it does have some pretty large metro areas. Although, like Japan, they trail off much faster than the EU's or US's metro area populations do. That said, this is the graph of metro areas, and looking at the graph of city populations, well, that one green dot that broke the formatting of the graph in a way that I haven't figured out how to fix is Sao Paulo, a city of 12.5 million people. Now this graph has 2 curious patterns that I'd like to point out. The first is that the largest cities in the US, the EU, and Japan are all very close in size, and the second largest cities in the US, EU, and Japan are very close in size. Meanwhile, Brazil's off doing entirely its own thing with Sao Paulo and Rio de Janeiro. The other pattern I like to point out is that the EU line very closely follows the Brazil line, and the US line very closely follows the Japan line. Why? I'm not actually quite sure. I did not find anyone who gave a plausible reason for why this might be, although I did find other people who noticed the same approximate pattern. Now, in case you were looking at those 2 graphs of all 4 countries and reminiscing about the wall of numbers from earlier, well, I can fix that. Because this is what the spreadsheet looks like once Japan and Brazil have been added. Now, through the power of spreadsheets, I have added up the populations of all the listed metro areas for each country. For the US, it is 233 million people, the EU 165, Japan 88, Brazil, I'm just going to go ahead and call that 100 million people. Now, for context, 233 million people is slightly under 2/3 of the US, 165 million people is slightly over 1/3 of the EU, 88 million people is a little over 1/2 of Japan, and 100 million people is a little under 1/2 of Brazil. So, strictly speaking, the US has the greatest percentage of its population represented in this spreadsheet, although that isn't exactly fair given that it has 4.5 times as many cities on the list as Japan does. Now, the other thing that I've done is that Japan has 13 cities on the list, and so I've gone and added up the populations of the 13 largest cities in the US, the EU, and Brazil. And so you can see that the 13 largest cities in the US are actually larger than the 13 largest cities in Japan. Though, to be fair, the US has 2 and a bit times the population of Japan. I've also done the same thing for Brazil, and here you can see that actually both the US and the EU have more people in its first 28 metro areas than Brazil does. Just to give one last little tidbit and some further context as to how much of the US is represented in these 65 metro areas, there are 28 Brazilian metro areas on the list. The first 28 US metro areas on the list add up to a total population of 176 million people. All 65 EU metro areas on the list add up to a population of 165 million people. So 11 million fewer, or... There's not a single number on this spreadsheet that begins with 11. How is that even possible? There's a 14, there's a 13, there's a 12, there's a 10, there's a 9, there's everything lower than it, but there's no 11. Well, thank you for watching and have a nice day.